So use extra, extra virgin olive oil. It's 100% pure, like me.
There are moments in television history that get quietly erased. Not with dramatic announcements or public debates, just silence. A scheduled air date that comes and goes. A title that disappears from episode guides. A piece of finished, fully produced television that simply ceases to exist in any official capacity. For over 3 decades, one episode of Married with Children lived that exact fate. It had a cast. It had a script. It had a director, a crew, lighting setups, and completed footage. And yet, for reasons that were never fully explained to the public, it vanished before a single American viewer could watch it on their television screen. That episode was called I'll See You in Court. And after more than 30 years of rumors, fan speculation, urban legends, and whispered conversations at cast reunions, it is finally, genuinely, officially, coming back. The question isn't just what's in it. The question is why it was buried in the first place, what that burial reveals about the era that produced it, and why the world in 2025 is somehow the right moment for it to resurface. To understand all of that, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what Married with Children actually was, what it meant, and why it terrified so many powerful people at the height of its success. When Married with Children premiered on the Fox network in April of 1987, American primetime television was living inside a very comfortable fantasy. The dominant family sitcoms of the era were built around a specific emotional architecture: loving parents, manageable conflicts, warm resolutions, and a gentle moral lesson delivered somewhere around the 20-minute mark. Families on television were aspirational. They were patient with each other. They learned and grew. Problems dissolved. Nobody stayed bitter. Nobody stayed broke. Nobody admitted that marriage could feel like a trap or that parenthood could hollow a person out. Married with Children looked at that entire framework and rejected it completely. Al Bundy was not a loving father quietly struggling beneath a cheerful exterior. He was openly, vocally miserable, a man who had peaked at 17 years old during a high school football game and had spent every subsequent year watching his life contract around him. He sold women's shoes for a living, a job he despised, to customers he despised, for a paycheck that barely covered the bills. He sat on his couch with his hand in his waistband and dreamed of escape that never came. Peg Bundy wasn't the idealized television wife either. She didn't cook. She didn't clean. She spent money they didn't have, watched television they couldn't afford, and treated domestic responsibility as something that applied to other people. Their daughter Kelly was written as spectacularly unaware of the world around her. Their son Bud was scheming, self-interested, and persistently unsuccessful with women. The Bundys were not a family to admire. They were a family to recognize. That recognition was the entire engine of the show's appeal. For working-class viewers who had spent years watching television families solve their problems neatly and emerge stronger and wiser, the Bundys felt honest in a way that was almost shocking. The show didn't moralize. It didn't resolve. It just kept going, episode after episode, with Al Bundy staring into the middle distance and wondering where it all went wrong. Audiences found that darkly hilarious. Critics found it irresponsible. Moral watchdog groups found it actively dangerous. And Fox, the scrappy upstart network that had launched the show as part of its campaign to compete with the established broadcast giants, found itself holding something genuinely powerful and genuinely unpredictable. The show ran for 11 seasons. It became one of the defining cultural artifacts of late 1980s and early 1990s American popular culture. It shaped how television could talk about class, about gender, about the gap between the American dream and American reality. And all along, it was fighting a running battle with censors, advertisers, and public pressure groups who wanted it toned down, cleaned up, or cancelled outright. By the time the show reached its 3rd season in 1989, the writers had established a very clear sense of how far they could push things. Sexual innuendo was standard. Crude jokes about the Bundy marriage were expected. Al's extended complaints about women, about poverty, about the indignities of his daily existence, these were the backbone of the show's humor. The writing staff knew the guardrails. They tested them regularly. But they also understood, more or less, where the line was. I'll See You in Court crossed it, not through gratuitous content in the traditional sense, but through the nature of what it was actually about beneath the jokes. The plot followed Al and Peg Bundy checking into a cheap, run-down motel in an attempt to bring some novelty to their stagnant marriage. Their neighbors, Steve and Marcy Rhodes, happened to have the same idea and check into the same establishment around the same time. What neither couple knows is that the motel has been installing hidden cameras in its rooms and secretly recording guests. When the Bundys discover that footage of their private encounter has been captured without their knowledge or consent, and potentially distributed, they do what Al Bundy always does when cornered: they decide to sue. The courtroom that follows is played for absurdity, with testimony so awkward and situations so uncomfortable that the humor operates on the edge of genuine unease. On the surface, it sounds like a typical Married with Children premise. The execution was sharp. The cast was in full command of their characters. By every internal metric, it was a solid episode of television that fit comfortably within the show's established tone. But when it reached Fox executives in the specific climate of 1989, the reaction was immediate alarm. Because the episode wasn't just raunchy, it was raunchy about something real. The hidden filming of people in intimate situations without their consent, the exposure of that footage, the humiliation of having your private life become public spectacle, these weren't abstract comedic premises. They were things that actually happened to actual people. And in a media environment where those things were rarely discussed openly, putting them at the center of a primetime sitcom, even a satirical one, felt like stepping onto unmarked and potentially explosive ground. The legal dimensions alone gave the network pause. Non-consensual recording. Sexual content captured without permission. The implications for how such material could be distributed. In 1989, the legal frameworks for dealing with these situations were underdeveloped at best. The episode, even wrapped in slapstick and Bundebrand humiliation, was essentially making jokes about something that had real victims and no clear legal remedy. That made Fox's lawyers deeply uncomfortable. And Fox's lawyers made Fox's executives deeply uncomfortable. And Fox's executives made the decision that would define this episode's history for the next 30 years. They pulled it. Quietly, without announcement, without explanation to the public. It simply disappeared from the broadcast schedule. To fully understand why I'll See You in Court was buried when it was, you have to understand the specific moment in which the burial happened. The episode didn't get pulled in a vacuum. It got pulled in the aftermath of one of the most consequential advertiser boycotts in American television history, a campaign that had fundamentally altered how Fox thought about risk and how seriously the network took its most controversial property. Terry Rakolta was a homemaker from Michigan with no particular background in media activism. In early 1989, she watched an episode of Married with Children and was disturbed by what she saw. The episode in question wasn't I'll See You in Court. It was a different installment, but it contained the kind of sexually suggestive humor that was standard for the show. Rakolta didn't simply change the channel. She sat down and wrote letters, detailed, articulate, specifically targeted letters, to the major corporations whose advertisements appeared during the broadcast. She described what she had seen. She explained why she found it objectionable. She asked them to reconsider their association with the program. The response exceeded anything she could have anticipated. Major advertisers, including Kellogg's and Coca-Cola, withdrew their advertising from the show. The story became national news. Rakolta was interviewed on television programs across the country. Conservative commentators praised her campaign as a model of engaged citizenship. What had begun as one woman's personal objection became a coordinated, highly visible challenge to Fox's judgment in airing the show at all. For Fox, which was still a young and financially vulnerable network at that time, the Rakolta boycott represented a genuine existential threat. The network's entire brand identity was built around being bold and countercultural. But brand identity doesn't pay the bills, advertising revenue does. If significant advertisers continued to withdraw because of controversy around Married with Children, the show's future became genuinely uncertain. The executives who had been willing to let the show push limits were suddenly asking much harder questions about exactly which limits were worth pushing and which were simply too costly. It was into this atmosphere of corporate anxiety and heightened scrutiny that I'll See You in Court arrived. The episode had been filmed before the boycott fully escalated. The writers hadn't specifically calibrated it to the new climate. But when Fox's leadership looked at the plot, hidden cameras, intimate footage, non-consensual recording, courtroom proceedings involving sexual material, they saw a grenade. Not because the content was unprecedented by the show's own standards, but because the timing was catastrophic. Pulling the episode cost them one episode. Airing it could cost them the show. The calculation, in 1989, was not even close. Inside the production, nobody saw it coming. The cast had rehearsed the episode like any other. The director had blocked the scenes. The crew had lit the motel set and the courtroom and wrapped filming with the usual combination of controlled chaos and professional efficiency that defined a Married with Children production week. Ed O'Neill, who had spent 2 seasons delivering monologues about the degradations of selling shoes to ungrateful women, reportedly couldn't quite comprehend why this particular episode had triggered the network's alarm system when so much of what he'd already performed had sailed through without incident. Katey Sagal, who played Peg Bundy with a sly and knowing energy that was one of the show's great underappreciated pleasures, found the script genuinely funny and consistent with everything the show had been doing. The premise of Ul and Peg becoming inadvertent subjects of an unauthorized recording struck her as perfectly calibrated to the characters, deeply unsexy, deeply awkward, and absolutely mortifying in the specific way that only the Bundys could be mortified. It wasn't glamorous or titillating. It was the opposite. It was two people who had long since lost any romantic mystique with each other being exposed in the most humiliating possible context. That was the joke. That was always the joke with the Bundys. Michael G. Moy, one of the show's co-creators, later reflected that the episode had passed through the normal pre-production approval process without generating unusual concern. The writers had simply written what they thought was a strong episode. There had been no early warning signals from the network, no note suggesting the premise was heading somewhere problematic. The pullback happened entirely because of external pressure. The Rakolta campaign, the advertiser nervousness, the sudden institutional anxiety about what association with the show might cost corporate partners. The episode became a casualty not of its own content but of the cultural moment into which it had the misfortune of arriving. 4 years afterward, the episode occupied a strange place in the memories of the people who had made it. Some crew members joked that it had become a kind of Bermuda Triangle in the show's history. Finished, complete, existing somewhere in a storage facility, but inaccessible and never discussed in any official capacity. There were no press releases about why it hadn't aired. There were no acknowledgements in interviews that it had ever been pulled. It simply wasn't part of any rerun package,